My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m., we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, castle doctrine and stand your ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of volunteers from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Welcome to this week's episode of Guns, Politics, and Freedom. Later in the show, we will be fortunate to have as our guest renowned gun writer Dave Workman, editor-in-chief of thegunmag.com and Liberty Park Press, and communications director for the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. We will discuss Joe Biden's recent comments in New York, the lies he insists on repeating about guns, how he intends to make you the scapegoat for skyrocketing crime that leftists created, and most importantly, what he really wants. But first, this just in gun rights news. Remember those old Girls Gone Wild videos you used to see advertised on TV? Well, let's call this one ATF Agents Gone Wild. Even beyond recent efforts by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives to circumvent Congress and push gun control by executive fiat, Gun Owners of America just caught the ATF red-handed as it puts together the rudiments of a national gun registry, which is prohibited by both the 1986 Firearms Owners Protection Act and the 1994 Brady Act. You may recall that last November, GOA obtained leaked documents showing that the Biden administration, in the past year alone, stockpiled the records of more than 54 million U.S. gun owners, and is poised to drastically alter gun regulations to ensure that information on Americans who own firearms ultimately ends up in the federal government's hands. When a licensed gun store goes out of business, its private records detailing gun transactions become ATF property and are stored at a federal site in West Virginia. That allows the ATF to stockpile scores of gun records, creating widespread suspicion they're using the records to create a national gun registry in violation of the law. Suspicions increased when it was revealed the ATF obtained 53.8 million paper records and another 887,000 electronic records just for fiscal year 2021. And the procurement of those records by the ATF comes as the Biden administration moves to alter current laws to ensure that gun records are stored in perpetuity. You see, currently, gun shops can destroy those records after 20 years. No more. Then in December, John Crump, writing in AmmoLand.com, reported the contents of a leaked ATF conference call, revealing that Walmart would give its records to the ATF for 500 of the 2,388 stores in which it currently sells firearms because it planned to stop selling firearms in those 500 stores, even though it was not required to, since the ATF is permitted by statute to collect only out-of-business records from FFLs under 18 U.S. Code Section 923 G4, only if the firearms or ammunition business is, quote, discontinued. And further noting that AmmoLand.com news internal sources provided evidence that the ATF has been employing third-party contractors with high-speed scanners to digitize these records, to perform optical character recognition upon them, and transform the documents into a searchable database. Crump reached out to Gun Owners of America and spoke to their legislative counsel, Mike Hammond, who said, and I quote, "The McClure-Volkmer Amendment prevents the federal government from keeping a gun registry. We now have a federal agency that is supposed to be enforcing the law, but is actually breaking the law." But wait, there's more. As reported by John Crump, once again writing in AmmoLand.com, in late November, Congressman Michael Cloud, Republican of Texas, and 51 other Republican Congress members sent a letter to ATF questioning its growing database of personal information about America's gun purchases. Said the letter in part, and I quote, "We are concerned that this administration is leveraging its power in a way to establish a federal gun registry. Moreover, we are opposed to a recent proposed regulation that would require federal firearms licensees to facilitate the creation of a federal gun registry." Incidentally, I'm proud to say that of the 51 Republicans who signed that letter, it included our own Madison Cawthorn and Congressman Ted Budd, who is happily running for the U.S. Senate to replace retiring Richard Burr. Well, at long last, those Republicans got their answer to the letter, and here it is. And I quote, "In total, ATF manages $920,664,765 out of business records as of November 2021. This includes an estimated number of hard copy records that are awaiting conversion. It is currently estimated that 865,787,086 of those records are in digitized format." Let that sink in for a minute. The ATF has nearly 1 billion firearms records, which are almost all digitized. Worse, the numbers don't add up, since the number of ATF firearms records has tripled since 2016. When the ATF reportedly held only 285 million records. The question is how the ATF managed to add 637 million records in the past 5 years if it's based only on out-of-business records. The Bureau also didn't comment on the explosion of the number of records by the ATF. If all of that isn't enough, Crump also notes that the ATF has been pressuring federally licensed firearms dealers to digitize their records and has recently changed the regulation under which an FFL could destroy records after 20 years, meaning those records will now be permanent. And then, of course, we have a report from the General Accountability Office, which notes that of the ATF's 4 data systems, 2 did not always comply with the Appropriations Act restriction prohibiting consolidation or centralization of FFL records. Translated, it's becoming obvious that the ATF is violating federal law to create a nearly 1 billion record national firearm registry, including apparently gathering records in illegal ways. More on this as information becomes available. But for now, anytime you hear gun control advocates whining for universal background checks to include private gun transfers, understand that their real goal is to ensure that all firearms records, including private transfers, are included in the National Gun Registry, which they are working even now to create. Last week, Joe Biden finally admitted that skyrocketing urban crime across the U.S. is a problem. You think? And he stood with New York City Mayor Eric Adams, New York State Governor Kathy Hochul, and Attorney General Merrick Garland to announce solutions to the problem. Well, that's the good news. The bad news is that the ones they blamed for all that crime is you, the lawful gun owner. And that means Uncle Joe his proposed solutions largely involved infringing on your rights. Visiting New York one day after the massive funeral for the second of 2 NYPD cops who were gunned down last month, Joe's welcoming committee, was not entirely welcoming. Indeed, the messages from the crowd seemed to be either "Let's go, Brandon," or chanting "No vaccine mandate." And thanks either to discipline or more likely being oblivious to the crowds, Joe stayed on message. And that message was that the guns are the root of all present evil and that the solution lies in making sure people who aren't allowed to have a gun don't get one in the first place. You know, people like his son, Hunter Biden, who obtained a gun license after perjuring himself on a Form 4473, but was never prosecuted. Biden then went on to recount his usual litany of lies. Now, I know what you're thinking. Maybe he's just being his usual dementia-ridden self and doesn't know that he's misstating all sorts of things with respect to guns and gun control. Sorry, I don't buy it. His lies have been so thoroughly fact-checked, hell, even the Washington Post gave him 4 Pinocchios, that even the Mr. Magoo ostensibly running our country could not be so unaware. So in our next segment, we'll be joined by renowned gun writer Dave Workman, whose recent piece in the Liberty Press was, quote, Biden perpetuates falsehoods about Second Amendment in New York comments. But first, a short break. You're listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. After the break, we will return with Dave Workman and exactly how Joe Biden plans to exploit the epidemic of crime to curtail private gun ownership. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. As our guest today, we are lucky to have Dave Workman, editor-in-chief of thegunmag.com and Liberty Park Press, and communications director for the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. Welcome, Dave.
Well, it's very nice of you to have me, Paul. I've been looking forward to this, and we've got some interesting stuff to talk about, don't we?
At first, I apologize for being long overdue in having you on the show. I'll make sure not to let that happen again. Anyways, so Dave, on Friday you wrote a piece in the Liberty Park Press entitled Biden Perpetuates Falsehood About Second Amendment in New York Comments. I guess Crazy Joe went to New York that day, and after a massive turnout for the 2 New York Police Department, there were law enforcement officers that were gunned down there, and he delivered a speech right next to Democrat Mayor Eric Adams, Democrat Governor Kathy Hochul, and Democrat Attorney General Merrick Garland. So Uncle Joe acknowledged the skyrocketing crimes. I'm sure he acknowledged that this is the result of his leftist policies, right?
Well, no, let's not go that far.
Maybe not.
Joe Biden historically hasn't taken blame for anything that I know of, and he has certainly tried to lay blame on guns and gun owners, and this myth that he has invented, and he's repeated it several times, and he's actually been called on the carpet for it by none other than the Washington Post fact checker, Glenn Kessler, who is, regardless of what anybody thinks about the Washington Post as a newspaper, Kessler is one of the best in the business when calling people for just prevarications and canards and all that stuff that they engage in. And he doesn't play favorites. He goes after Republicans. He goes after Democrats. He goes after the president. He's very consistent with that. And among the press, I think he's got a pretty good amount of respect. So anyway, Biden has created and perpetuated this tale, and it is a fairy tale, that the Second Amendment, when it was adopted back in, I think it was 1789, 1790, it was right around that area. He claimed that the amendment provided for preventing some people from owning guns. He claims that at the time people couldn't, for example, own cannons, and that some people couldn't own firearms at all. And that is absolute nonsense. Mm-hmm. He has been corrected not just by Kessler, but Kessler took the time to interview people, including David Kopel, who's with the Independence Institute down in Colorado, and he's one of these guys. And there's a handful of them that are recognized historians and experts on the history of the Second Amendment. Kopel said that's crazy. There was no such law at the time, and frankly, if you look back at history, there were a lot of people who did own cannons, and most of them had been taken away from the British.
Well, that was the whole privateer thing, wasn't it?
Well, sure, yeah, and at the time, historically, we were just beginning to engage in world trade as an independent nation. If you look over on the Mississippi River, there were keel boats at the time, and a lot of those guys had what they called swivel guns, which were smaller cannons, but they were designed to fend off raiding Indians or actually a lot of river pirates. Really, that was the big problem down there, because they would ambush these keel boats and kill everybody on board and take whatever cargo they could. So anyway, long story short, Biden did it again in New York the other day. And I listened to his speech, and I thought, no, wait a minute. Come on, Joe, you know better than that. Well, I wrote about it, and it has gotten some interesting responses. And every once in a while, I'm glad to give my readers a history lesson and try to keep these guys straight. But Joe Biden, once again, committed that sin of all sins. He's perpetuated a myth that he knows it's a myth, yet he keeps doing it.
Well, I mean, let's face it, he's taking the heat off him, because we both know that the reasons for this skyrocketing violence across the nation are persecuting police for their supposed systemic racism. They're defunding police departments across the country. They're letting violent criminals out without even requiring bail. They've got the refusal of leftist district attorneys like Manhattan's Alvin Bragg to prosecute criminals. And, I mean, they've decimated police forces. So he refuses to admit that these, of course, are the reasons for this. And instead, who's he going to blame? Us.
Well, he's going to blame the gun owners, naturally.
Yep.
And we're an easy target for the self-appointed progressives. And as I've written several times, and I think I've even said this to you, while we're socially chatting in some gun rights policy conversation, if this is progress, we all ought to go back to log cabins or maybe even caves.
Yeah. A matter of fact, I'm putting together a book for activists, and one of the things I've said is that these progressives are not progressive. These liberals are not liberal. I'm a liberal. They are fascists. Well, actually, more properly, they are leftists. So, they manipulate the vocabulary and make you use words like progressive, because, of course, that means that if you oppose them, you must be regressive. But anyways, now, I grant you it's nice to hear that Biden admits that crime is spiking, okay? Homicide rates reaching record levels in 16 cities, 5% increase in American cities from 2020, a 44% increase from 2019. And, I mean, it was just days ago that Jan Psaki claimed that spike in crime didn't even exist, right? I mean, what exactly do you think their end goal is here?
Well, first and foremost, I think the end goal is what they've always wanted it to be, an end to private firearms ownership. They want to turn the Second Amendment right into a government-regulated privilege, and it goes beyond that. In fact, I think the danger of their movement can be seen not with really the Second Amendment in recent days, but with the First Amendment. We've seen reports how local school districts or local libraries want to ban certain books, Catcher in the Rye, or even films or books about racial injustice. To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, I saw was on a list. And if you think back to Germany in 1935 or 36, maybe it was 37, they didn't just ban books, they burned them. And I'm waiting for somebody to start a bonfire someplace. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that the far left is engaging in today. And frankly, if they keep counting, or they keep contending that people like you and me are fascists and Nazis, if they want to find fascists and Nazis, I tell them really quick, go stare in a mirror.
Yeah. Here. I mean, they keep talking about gun violence. That's another one of these phrases they've inserted into the public consciousness.
Yeah.
But I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the increase in crime across the country right now, it's not just crimes committed with guns, right?
No, it's there's been a spike in all kinds of violent crime, and lo and behold, a lot of this is happening, if not all of it, is happening in and around cities controlled by far-left Democrats. And I use Washington State, for example, as an example, because over the years, starting in 2014, a billionaire-backed gun control group based in Seattle, surprise there, has passed a couple of really stupid gun control initiatives, one requiring universal background checks, and the other one limiting sales of so-called semi-automatic assault rifles only to those people who are 21 and over and who can provide proof that they have taken a gun safety course. Now, ever since they started passing these initiatives and trying to strengthen their gun control laws here, the murder rate hasn't gone down as they promised. It has gone up. Murder in
Dave,
Seattle.
I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, and we're going to pick up after the break. Folks, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with Dave Workman in our discussion of the truth behind Joe Biden's lies about gun control. My name is Paul Blown. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at HyattGuns.com. We're speaking with Dave Workman, the editor-in-chief for thegunmag.com and also Liberty Park Press. And we're talking about Biden's lies about gun control, particularly lately he's been talking, he and Jan Psaki and Merrick Garland, our Attorney General, have been talking about so-called gun violence. But, of course, what we've discovered is that the spike in violence across the country isn't just with guns. Now, overall, New York crime went up by 30.4%, grand larceny up by 66%, felony assault up by 35.6%, robbery up by 28.6%, rape up by 52.8%, and carjackings up by 55%. So basically, Dave, Biden and Garland are blaming lawful gun owners for crimes that aren't even being committed with guns. Would you agree?
Yeah, to some, at least some extent, I'd agree with that. And because they need a scapegoat, Paul. Mm-hmm. And gun owners are an easy scapegoat. The Second Amendment has always been the whipping boy for anybody on the far left who tries to find a reason, a deflection for their own failures of management and sound government. You look at Biden, he's been on Capitol Hill and really in Washington politics for a half a century. What has that guy really accomplished?
You said something interesting there. You said that, of course, that we're the whipping boy for, all manner of evil. Well, he's brought up some fairly specific stuff. Okay, he's talking about the iron pipeline. This is a phrase from the 90s we're talking about, right, or the early 2000s.
Right.
Illegal gun trafficking, supposedly. We're talking about ghost guns, and we're talking, he also mentioned the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, claiming that gun manufacturers can't be sued. And he's also talking about rogue gun dealers and punishing them. What is he really talking about with those four things?
Well, I think the big item on his agenda is to repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which he falsely claims gives blanket protection to firearms manufacturers from civil lawsuits. That is a lie.
Yes, it
and
is.
I think he knows that. It is an absolute lie. You can still file civil actions against gun makers for product problems, no quality control, for defective products, products that malfunction and causing. They can be sued for that stuff. Everybody can be sued for that. Car makers, if they've got a line of cars, they can get sued for that stuff too. But what he wants to do is to reopen the situation that we experienced back in the early or late 1990s and early 2000s, when municipalities around the country, I can think of New Orleans and Atlanta, Georgia, New York, Boston, Boston, and a lot of these places filed lawsuits against gun makers with the support of the gun control lobby. And the real idea behind all of that was not to hold these people responsible, was to break them financially. They wanted to bankrupt the gun industry in this country. And the problem with me as a journalist is they won't admit that.
Yep.
That's really what's going on here.
So basically, when Congress passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, they took out that so-called novel legal theory that they could actually sue people over properly functioning products that were quite legal. Now, that's one thing he wanted. Now, the other thing he wants that's real relevant is he wants to ban ghost guns, because ghost guns are being so often used in crime, which, of course, they aren't. But tell us what that ghost gun thing means, because, I mean, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking out there that the ATF is going to rule on next summer on so-called ghost guns. What are they really trying to do here?
Well, I think the heart and soul of this thing is that the Biden administration and his anti-gun cronies over on Capitol Hill and out in the private sector, they really want to bring an end to what is a tradition in the United States, and even a tradition before there was a United States, people building their own firearms for their own personal use. Now, of course, today we've advanced beyond the period of when you build your own flintlock rifle or your musket for taking game. We can now find parts and accessories for putting together a firearm. And I think the misnomer out there, if you find a lot of these so-called ghost guns that they say are showing up in crime, it's my understanding that they're really looking at guns that are built either AR-15 type rifles that are started with what they call an 80% kit, or handguns which have had the lower frame, the synthetic frame replaced over the existing action of that gun. Now, if you pull those guns apart, in a lot of cases, not all of them necessarily, but in a lot of cases, you'll find that there's a serial number on the firing mechanism in those guns. The fact that some of these replacement frames for pistols, for example, don't allow you to see that, well, that's nobody's fault, but this goes beyond even that.
We're talking about a lot of modern modular pistols here. Things like the SIG 320, like the P365, and a bunch of other guns where the fire control mechanism is actually the serialized part, and it actually fits within a frame that is in such a way that the serial number is exposed and shows. Now, from what I read in this notice of proposed rulemaking, the real goal here is to redefine frame or receiver so that they can actually start regulating parts of guns. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, that seems to be where they're going with this. And
so I'd have to fill out a Form 4473 every time I wanted a trigger mechanism or a firing pin or a bunch of other stuff. See, that's where they want to regulate every little piece of that gun that they can. That's what I read in that notice of proposed rulemaking.
Well, frankly, if you take a step back, Paul, and you and I are pretty good at doing this because I've seen you do it before. You take a step back and you just say, no, wait a minute, they're doing this, but this is really what they want, and what they want is to discourage people not only from building their own firearms, which has been, as I said, an American tradition for generations, and they want to discourage firearms owners ownership. Period. If they can make it so cumbersome and such a libel, a legal liability to own a firearm, they're going to do that. That's another way that they try to disarm the American public. They don't like the Second Amendment.
Incrementally end the private ownership of firearms. I mean, that's really what they're looking for.
Yeah. Exactly, and there's all kinds of ways to do that, by lawsuit, by putting an end to state preemption laws, for example, to allow the resurgence of checkerboard gun control from state to state. They can do it with regulations like this, making it really illegal for you to build your own firearm at home and put something together. That is really, I think, the end goal of these guys, and that's why I write about this stuff all the time, because they're always coming up with some new, different, special plan. But really, if you boil out all the perfidy there, it comes down to one thing: they want to end gun ownership.
Yep, exactly right. And I mean, you've put your finger on it, and they're going to do it one little bit at a time if they can. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Dave, thank you very much for bringing us up to speed on what's going on. How can people find it?
It's been a delight chatting with you, because you're an old friend of mine, and I really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh no!
Now, in answer to your question, see, I'm also a mind reader. People can find my stuff at libertyparkpress.com, thegunmag.com. I also write for American Handgunner Insider Online every week. I think on Sunday they post an article of mine. I write for ammoland.com, which is, I'm really proud to be working with Freddie Reel and those guys over there. It's a good bunch of people.
They certainly are.
And conservative Firing Line. I do a piece for them almost every day. So, look for my stuff. You can find, it's really an alternative to what you read in the daily newspapers. I'm the guy that tells the whole story.
I love it. Well, folks, thanks very much, Dave. We appreciate you bringing us up to speed. Folks, you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker. After a short break, we will return with still more critical information, enabling you to better defend your gun rights. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live. Our show is sponsored by Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop. Check them out at hyattguns.com. In our last segment, we discussed with renowned gun writer Dave Workman how Joe Biden consistently lies about the gun issue. It's not dementia. Those are deliberate lies. Biden lies about the Second Amendment, falsely claiming that when it was passed, the framers included restrictions on what weapons you could own. Biden lies about the source of the surge of violence in cities around the country, claiming it's due to increasing gun ownership, when in truth, it's the other way around. In truth, violence of all types, including violence not committed with guns, is up, especially in New York, where Biden told the lies. Overall, New York City crime is up 30.4%. Grand larceny up 66%. Felony assault up 35.6%. Robbery up 28.6%. Rape up 52.8%. And carjackings up 55%. It's the people who are arming up due to the violence that people like Biden have created. And Biden lies to hide the true source of the surge, namely leftist policies to defund police, leftist policies to release violent criminals without bail, leftist policies not to prosecute even violent crimes such as brandishing weapons, and leftist policies to demoralize police by claiming that everything they do to keep us safe is evidence of systemic racism, causing thousands of law enforcement officers to retire or just quit. Leftist policies which embolden criminal predators. In truth, before the riots of 2020 and leftist exploitation of those riots, violent crime had been trending down for decades. Biden lies about the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, passed by Congress to prevent cities from using overwhelming litigation to drive gun makers out of business. Here, he claims gun makers can't be sued, but in truth, they can be sued over defective products just like any other industry. The only thing they can't be sued over that are prohibited are suits over products which function exactly as intended. Biden lies about so-called ghost guns, firearms which are legally made for private use but cannot be transferred to others and are rarely used in crimes. In truth, the ATF regulation due out this spring about so-called ghost guns doesn't just deal with personally made firearms, but also redefines what constitutes the frame or receiver of a firearm, creating a potential nightmare as even tiny parts of guns would be regulated as if they were entire firearms, requiring background checks and Form 4473s. Biden lies about the so-called iron pipeline, resurrecting that decades-old lie that guns shipped from southern states, where they don't seem to cause a problem, somehow magically become the cause of problem and violence in urban centers like New York. Biden lies about so-called rogue dealers illegally selling guns. In truth, federally licensed dealers are tightly regulated. What he's really talking about is harassing gun dealers and driving them out of business. You see, during the Obama administration, Democrats weakened the Tiahrt Amendment, which prohibited the ATF from releasing gun tracing data. And the reason they did that was in order to make fallacious claims that large gun dealers in business for many years, who've sold many more guns than most others, and over decades, some of those guns might be used in crimes. Statistically, that's inevitable. They're trying to tell you that these law-abiding dealers are rogue gun dealers. And finally, Joe Biden is lying because he's scapegoating you, the lawful gun owner, for a crime wave he committed. So maybe right now you're saying, so what? Gun control advocates have been blaming crime on lawful gun ownership for generations. What's new about that? Well, you'd be right that gun control organizations from handgun control to Michael Bloomberg's Every Town for Gun Violence, have danced in the blood of victims every time yet another mass killing has been perpetrated in yet another supposedly gun-free zone where violent sociopaths know that citizens are disarmed. And yes, the media has for generations lied about the guns they tried to ban, doing things like playing video of fully automatic weapons, machine guns, firing while they talked about banning semi-automatic firearms, which are functionally identical to most hunting rifles. But there's a difference this time, a big difference. Do you know what it is? Think about it. If you haven't divined that difference, please allow me to enlighten you. It is that, unlike in the past, the politicians and media blaming you for violent crime are the ones who actually created that violence themselves. In other words, they aren't just exploiting violence committed by sociopaths, as they have in the past. Oh, no. It's the left which is creating that violence. Is that a coincidence? An accident, perhaps? Are leftists like Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez so stupid that they don't know what the policies they push will produce? Well, maybe AOC is that stupid, but we'll save that discussion for another day. Now, bear with me for a moment while I explain. In a few weeks, my new book will be out. It's entitled Rules for Anti-Radicals, a practical handbook for defeating leftism. That book details the legislative tactics my organization and I have been using to defeat leftists for nearly 30 years. I promise to let you know when pre-orders for the book become available, and I hope to start taking pre-orders by late February and to start shipping books by mid-April. But the point is this. I did lots of research for the book, including research on the individual my book answers, namely Saul Alinsky, the original author of Rules for Radicals, a practical primer for realistic radicals, which has for 50 years been the guidebook for leftists who are bent on hijacking American society. Now, the death of George Floyd at the hands of police on May 25, 2020, created the rationalization for mass riots across the U.S. If you're like most Americans, you've probably pondered what rioters and looters stand to gain. You've probably said, don't they know that if the police disengage, more people will be victimized by criminals? Well, to answer that question, let me quote Alinsky, and I quote, "The first step in community organization is community disorganization. The disruption of the present organization is the first step toward community organization. Present arrangements must be disorganized if they are to be displaced by new patterns. All change means disorganization of the old and organization of the new." Translated, in order to create the great socialist utopia they dream of, they must first destroy the existing society. None of this is an accident, folks. Now, I don't mean that this is some grand conspiracy theory to destroy American society. Of course not. Frankly, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. But to quote one sage, you don't have to be a member of the choir to sing from the same piece of sheet music. The hard leftists like Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, AOC, or Adam Schiff, they know the policies they promote will cost American lives. Hell, they might even regret it, although probably not, since you, after all, are just a peon to them. But the bottom line is that they've decided that those deaths and the curtailment of your civil liberties are a reasonable price to pay in order to replace our constitutional republic with the socialist autocracy they envision. So the next time a leftist starts whining that you should give up your guns because it will save the lives of children, tell them that it is their policies which are killing urban children and destroying the fabric of American society. And tell them you will be damned if you allow them to scapegoat you for what they have created. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on the Big Talker Network at bigtalker.live, where each Saturday at 1 p.m. and each Sunday at 5 p.m. we give you the ammunition to better defend your right to keep and bear arms. Please check out our sponsor, Hyatt Guns, America's largest gun shop, at hyattguns.com. You can also check out my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, spell out the and, gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, where you can find both my writings and earlier editions of this show. See you next week.